The essence of sin is disbelief, the state of estrangement from God, the flight from Him, the rebellion against Him, the elevation of preliminary concerns to the rank of ultimate concern. Man is bound to sin in all parts of his being, because he is estranged from God in his personal center. Neither his emotion, his will, nor his intellect is accepted from sin, and consequently from the perversion of their true nature. Paul Tillich. We can think about sin in a variety of ways. The Bible characterizes sin as debt, as slavery, as missing the mark, and as the opposite of faith. We could also talk about sin as the sickness of the soul or the archetypal addiction. But today we are going to focus on sin as estrangement from God. There have been several Christian thinkers who have characterized sin as separation, alienation, or estrangement. And for our purposes, we are going to take a look at a passage from the writing of Paul Tillich. We are all sinners born into a type of bondage or addiction, which we all perpetuate through our own actions. As we read in John's first epistle, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Relatedly, Kierkegaard wrote, "The most dangerous traitor of all is the one every person has within himself." Like any other type of addict, we don't want to admit we have a problem, but not far below the surface, we all know something is wrong. So with that in mind, we'll move on to the passage from Tillich. Estrangement is not a biblical term, but it is implied in most of the biblical descriptions of man's predicament. It is implied in the symbols of the expulsion from paradise, in the hostility between man and nature, in the deadly hostility of brother against brother, in the estrangement of nation from nation through the confusion of language, and in the continuous complaints of the prophets against their kings and people who turn to alien gods. Estrangement is implied in Paul's statement that man perverted the image of God into that of idols, in his classical description of man against himself, in his vision of man's hostility against man as combined with his disordered desires. In all these interpretations of man's predicament, estrangement is implicitly asserted. Therefore, it is certainly not unbiblical to use the term estrangement in describing man's existential situation. So Tillich starts out the passage saying the term estrangement is not necessarily a biblical term, but goes on to note that it is certainly implied by many stories and passages from the Bible. The Apostle Paul clearly had the same idea in mind when he wrote Ephesians, saying, "You are to no longer walk as the Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardening of their heart." The Apostle Paul not only identifies the problem of alienation or estrangement, but he also notes the solution. In Ephesians 4, Paul goes on to speak about a renewed spirit and becoming the new man. Even more relevant to our topic today, he says in 2 Corinthians 5:19, "God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses to them, and has committed us to the word of reconciliation." The solution to our condition of estrangement is reconciliation with God. After we have recognized our situation, our condition of estrangement, we can turn to God and be reconciled to him through faith in Christ. Before we get into what we might mean by faith, we'll first briefly consider what we mean by God, because if we are working with a shallow conception of him, we will be less inclined to seek reconciliation with him, or we might look for reconciliation in something lower than God. Starting with a quote from Robert Barron, "God is not a being in the world, one object, however supreme among many. The maker of the entire universe cannot be, himself, an item within the universe, and the one who is responsible for the nexus of causal relations in its entirety could never be a missing link in an ordinary scientific schema. Thomas Aquinas makes the decisive point when he says that God is not highest being, but rather the sheer act of being itself. God is neither a thing in the world nor the sum total of existing things. He is instead the unconditioned cause of a conditioned universe, the reason why there is something rather than nothing. Accordingly, God is not some good thing, but goodness itself, not some true object, but truth itself, not some beautiful reality, but beauty itself. This description of God clearly gets to his transcendent nature, but I think similarly to John defining God as love, it at the same time can be understood as describing God as immanent and personal. Anything containing any goodness, truth, or beauty is at least slightly tinged with the presence and the personality of the divine. God is the arena in which we live and move and have our being, and his spirit is also the dynamic agent which creates, sustains, and transforms life. God is the ground of being and also the animating personality with whom we can have a relationship. Christ, as mediator, is the only human who has perfectly reflected the image of God to the world, and through him we see the Father. Going back to Tillich and the meaning of faith, Tillich describes faith as ultimate concern. Tillich writes in his book, Dynamics of Faith, "Faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. The dynamics of faith are the dynamics of man's ultimate concern." Faith for the men of the Old Testament is the state of being ultimately and unconditionally concerned about Yahweh and about what he represents in demand, threat, and promise. Faith as ultimate concern is an act of the total personality. It happens in the center of the personal life, and it includes all its elements. Faith is the most centered act of the human mind. Faith as the embracing and centered act of the personality is ecstatic. It transcends both the drives of the non-rational unconscious and the structures of the rational conscious. It transcends them, but it does not destroy them. The reality of man's ultimate concern reveals something about his being, namely that he is able to transcend the flux of relative and transitory experiences of his ordinary life. Man is driven towards faith by his awareness of the infinite to which he belongs, but which he does not own like a possession. This is, in abstract terms, what concretely appears as the restlessness of heart within the flux of life. Tillich's definition of faith captures both important elements of what the biblical authors meant by faith. If faith means ultimate concern, then it grips all of our beliefs and informs all of our actions. Faith stands above mere beliefs or works and orients both towards the highest good, towards God. We will end today's exhortation with a passage from Paul Tillich's famous sermon titled, "You Are Accepted." The state of our whole life is estrangement from others and ourselves, because we are estranged from the ground of our being, because we are estranged from the origin and aim of our life, and we do not know where we have come from or where we are going. We are separated from the mystery, the depth, and the greatness of our existence. We hear the voice of that depth, but our ears are closed. We feel that something radical, total, and unconditioned is demanded of us, but we rebel against it, try to escape its urgency, and will not accept its promise. That fact brings us to the ultimate depth of sin, separated yet bound, estranged and yet belonging, the state which is called despair. We all know that we are bound inescapably to the ground of our being. The abyss of the separation is not always visible, but it has become more visible to our generation than to the preceding generations, because of our feeling of meaninglessness, emptiness, doubt, and cynicism, all expressions of despair, of our separation from the roots and the meaning of our life. Sin in its most profound sense, sin as despair abounds among us. But where sin abounded, grace did abound much more, says the Apostle Paul. We cannot transform our lives unless we allow them to be transformed by that stroke of grace. It happens or it does not happen, and certainly it does not happen if we try to force it upon ourselves, just as it shall not happen so long as we think in our self-complacency that we have no need of it. Grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. It strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. It strikes us when we feel our separation is deeper than usual because we have violated another life, a life which we loved, or from which we were estranged. It strikes us when our disgust for our own being, our indifference, our weakness, our hostility, and our lack of direction and composure have become intolerable to us. It strikes us when year after year the longed-for perfection of life does not appear, when the old compulsions reign within us as they have for decades, when despair destroys all joy and courage. Sometimes at that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness, and it is as though a voice were saying, "You are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not know. Do not ask for the name now, perhaps you will find it later. Do not try to do anything now, perhaps later you will do much. Do not seek for anything, do not perform anything, do not intend anything. Simply accept that you are accepted. If this happens to us, we experience grace. After such an experience, we may not be better than before, and we may not believe more than before, but everything is transformed. In that moment, grace conquers sin, and reconciliation bridges the gulf of estrangement."